morning, everyone. My name's Mike. I'm one of the ministers here at the church. If you're visiting with us this morning, a special welcome to you. We are delighted to have you with us this morning. We hope you'll stay around for a little bit afterwards so we can meet you and get to know you a little bit. One thing to make note of before we get into our lesson for today, as Dave mentioned, next Sunday is our Mission Sunday. We'll be talking about the MAP program. We'll talk a little bit about a couple other mission things too. And it's our annual international potluck. And so come prepared to enjoy that. Please bring stuff for others to enjoy at that. And please plan to stay following service next Sunday to enjoy our international potluck. And I don't know if this was ever a decided thing or it just started happening, but apparently on International Potluck Sunday, people wear international garments. And so if you come from another country, clothes from another country, and you want to wear that on Sunday, I encourage you to do that. I'm excited. I'm almost never here on Mission Sunday. And so this will be one of the first ones I've actually got to be here for. I'm looking forward to that and sharing that with you next Sunday. We are in our final week series on the book of Ephesians called The Fork in the Road. And this week we are going to be in chapter 6. So if you have a Bible, open it up or tap and swipe or whatever you need to do to get to Ephesians chapter 6. If you didn't bring a Bible with you this morning, no worries. All the verses that we will be looking at will be up here on the screen for you as well to see. Every good story or book comes to a climax, to a crescendo, to a tipping point. And a good book or a movie will reach that climactic moment where there's a big battle or a mystery is solved or the day is saved or the conflict's resolved or the bad guy is defeated or the boy finally gets the girl or something like that happens. And then they'll give you one more scene or chapter. And this final scene kind of provides closure, not just for the characters, but for the audience as well. To kind of bring them down from the intensity of that high point and leave them with a feeling of peace and calm. Occasionally, someone will throw in a last twist or wrinkle or cliffhanger, but that's usually just to set up the sequel. And if the story just kind of abruptly ends right at that high point, most of us are left feeling frustrated and unsatisfied. We feel like we've been left hanging and we're amped up and we're ready for more, but there's no more to be had, or we are free falling back down to reality and we don't like either of those feelings. Speakers and even preachers do the same thing. Public speakers are taught to end with a short conclusion, a brief summary to wind up their thoughts. And Paul does much the same thing when he's writing his letters. You can tell that chapter 6, verse 10 is this point in Ephesians because Paul begins with his standard conclusion segue, finally. And although, to be fair, sometimes Paul is much like some movies like Return of the King that had 4 different post-climax moments. And Paul kind of does this in his letter sometimes, and he says, finally, and then finally, and finally, and finally once more. Or it turns out that he puts the finally in and then talks for 2 or 3 more chapters. But here in Ephesians, we only get one finally. And what follows is kind of Paul's conclusion to his letter. Last week we saw the climactic moment of Paul's letter. I will remind you that Paul knew these people he was writing to. He had lived with them. He had been part of their church. He probably converted a large number of them. And he loved them all, but he had heard some things that concerned him. And so he wrote this letter, all of which builds up to chapter 5, verse 21, where Paul says, I love you guys, and God loves each one of you, and I know you're having some problems, so here's what I want you to do. Submit to one another. Not because one person is in any way superior to you, and not because then they'll owe you one, or not in an attempt to gain leverage or to get some kind of reward from them. Simply submit to one another out of respect for who Jesus is. out of a response to what Jesus has done, out of a recognition that Jesus loves them as much as he loves you. And that's the climactic moment of Paul's letter. So where does he go from there? He goes here. Finally, be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. Paul says, I get it. It's not easy. And you're not likely going to be able to pull this off on your own. But the good news is you don't have to try to. Be strong in the Lord and in his mighty power. And then he looks at 3 ways for us to do that. This week I was watching my son playing a video game. The game was called Rocket League, and it's basically like soccer, except you have a giant soccer ball, and instead of kicking it with your feet, you smash into the ball with cars. And he was playing it, and I was watching him for a while, and he was doing really well. Like, every time he hit the ball, he scored. And then I observed something, and I said, are you playing against nobody? And he said, well, yeah, because you can choose if you go 2-on-2 or 3-on-3 or whatever, but when you win, you get these bonuses for the game. And so I set it to 1 versus 0, and I'm doing, hey, look, I just got another one. Okay. The opening point of Paul's conclusion is that we are not playing 1 versus 0. First of all, as he's already mentioned in verse 10, God is on our side, which is a pretty awesome teammate to have. Some of you may have seen this commercial in the last couple weeks.
Canada is the home of hockey. Any hockey player would love to have the Canada experience. It was all amazing seeing our jerseys hanging all around. It's a great day for us. It's a dream to be in Canada, to play our first game in full gear. It's all amazing. So let's try our best, let's push hard, and everything will fall our way.
Hey guys.
Sydney. Seeing my favorite player coming through the door wearing our jersey, I felt like I was in heaven.
Tim McKinnon show up. The two of the best players in the world right now, and they walk into the Ice Lions dressing room and they say, hey guys, we're on your team. Imagine how those guys felt. Imagine how that changed their perspective. Imagine how that altered their odds of winning. And that's just a fraction of what Paul wants his readers to feel coming out of verse 10. Prior to verse 10, we are the Kenyan hockey team. But in verse 10, Sydney and Nathan McKinnon show up and walk into our dressing room, except they are followed by Wayne Gretzky and Mario Lemieux in the prime. And behind them are Jaromir Jagr and Guy Lafleur and Vladislav Tretiak and Gordie Howe and Bobby Orr and Maurice the Rocket Richard and Ken Dryden and Nicholas Lindstrom and Bobby Hall and Stevie Yzerman, Ray Bork, Martin Brodeur, and Joe Sakic, of course, and, oh, why not, Tim Horton come in. And behind them come a couple dozen more players. And they're all at the peak of their career when they walk in. And even though you may not recognize all of those names, you understand that these are some of the absolute best players to have ever played the game. And now they're playing for us. And even that understates the point that verse 10 is trying to make. Paul reminds us that God is on our side. More precisely, we are now on God's side, and that is a game changer. Paul states it even more plainly in his letter to the church in Rome when he says, "What shall we say about such wonderful things as these? If God is for us, who can ever be against us?" We're not in this alone. The great, wonderful, loving, merciful, powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing, present everywhere, all the time God that Paul spends the first half of his letter describing is on our side. When you become a follower of Christ, you are now on his team. But that's not all, Paul says. He adds, for the record, the other dressing room isn't empty. He goes on to say this in verse 11. Put on the full armor of, put on all of God's armor, so that you will be able to stand firm against all the strategies of the devil. For we are not fighting against flesh and blood enemies, but against evil rulers and authorities of the unseen world, against powers of this dark world, against spiritual forces of evil in the heavenly realms. Ooh, that sounds intriguing, doesn't it? Mike, can you explain to us exactly what that looks like, or exactly how that works? Nope, I cannot. These are just two short verses, are just a tiny glimpse into a subject that spans the entire Bible and therefore can't possibly give us a complete picture. But more importantly, I am confident in saying that I don't know exactly what that looks like or exactly how that works. I have some thoughts and I have some ideas, but I'm not certain about any of it. And furthermore, my understanding of these things has changed and evolved over the years, and I suspect it will continue to do so in the years ahead. And I know some very godly, sincere, well-studied, Bible-believing people who I respect and value their opinion and insights. And those people, some of them have very different views from each other on what all this looks like and how all this works. So no, I can't explain it in detail. But for Paul's point here in Ephesians, fully understanding the details isn't actually essential. You see, Paul's goal here is not to give a comprehensive explanation of the functioning of the spirit world. His point is that there's someone fighting against us. There's someone working against us, someone trying to trip us up and divide us and make us lose heart and make us give up, someone who is desperately trying to defeat us. And this someone or someones, these forces of evil work behind the scenes. They're unseen, and they are nonetheless, they are powerful, and they are a force to be reckoned with. And they are way too strong for us to have any hope of standing up to on our own. As much as who is in our locker room should reassure us, knowing who's in the other locker room should unnerve us. And were it not for God being on our side, it should terrify us. But even with God on our side, it's going to be a tough fight. We're going to take some hits along the way. We're going to be against the rope at times. And if I'm counting on my own intelligence or influence or wealth or power or beauty or charisma or strength or cleverness to get me through, I am sorely mistaken, and I have gravely underestimated the opponent I am up against. John sums up the situation well when he writes this. He says, "You, dear children, are from God, and you have overcome them because the one who's in you is greater than the one who's in the world." Which brings us to section 2. Paul goes on in verse 13. "Therefore, because of all this stuff I just said, put on every piece of God's armor, so that you will be able to resist the enemy in times of evil. And then after the battle, you will still be standing firm. Stand your ground, Put on the belt of truth and the body armor of God's righteousness. For shoes, put on peace that comes from the good news so that you will be fully prepared. In addition to all these, hold up the shield of faith to stop the fiery arrows of the devil. Put on salvation as your helmet and take the sword of the Spirit, which is the word of God. And this analogy makes sense for Paul's time. The people in Ephesus would see soldiers walking around in armor as commonly as we see someone walking around wearing rider gear. In fact, at the time that Paul wrote this, he was most likely chained to a Roman soldier, or at least had one standing very nearby keeping an eye on him. So for Paul, writing to the Ephesians in the first century, a soldier's armor makes the ideal analogy to draw on. I was in Belgium a few weeks ago, and I was in the city of Ghent, and I had the chance to take a tour of the Gravenstein, which is a 12th century castle belonging to the Count of Flanders. And inside there were numerous artifacts, including several suits of armor. And I'll be honest, that was the first suit of armor I had seen in quite some time, and I suspect it'll be a while before I see another suit of armor, because armor is just not commonplace in our world, which perhaps makes the imagery that Paul is calling upon here a little harder for us to grasp. We get the general idea, but we don't immediately resonate with the nuances of the analogy. We don't instinctively know the specific value or function of each particular item. I did a bunch of reading on this the last couple weeks, trying to process all the different explanations for each different piece of armor and what it represents. And there's value in doing that, I think. But what I found is that there was a lot of variety in how people interpreted that, and between the different scholars and what they applied to the belt and the chest plate and the sandals and the shield and the helmet. And most were quite general based on our current understanding of first century armor. But it occurred to me that perhaps instead of giving the Ephesians an itemized list of 5 specific pieces of armor, maybe what Paul's trying to do is paint a picture for them. And in that big picture, there are 2 important elements. The first thing that you can't help but notice about these pieces of armor that Paul mentioned is that they are largely defensive items. For the most part, they are designed to protect the soldier from the enemy's attack. The chest plate and the shield and the helmet are obvious. Sandals and belts are a little more neutral until you understand the details of how they were used. A sword is often viewed as a weapon of attack, but it can be equally valuable as a tool of defense against an enemy's blows. And given the overall context of the passage, it would seem that the message Paul is trying to convey is that the purpose of this armor is to protect us from attack, to defend us from the enemy's blows. Perhaps the best parallel for us would be sporting equipment. A football player would never enter the field without a helmet. And a baseball catcher would never crouch behind home plate without the chest plate and his glove. And a hockey player would never skate onto the ice without his shin pad and other gear. A soccer player would never hit the pitch without his cleats on. And these items do a great job in protecting players from injury, but their value is significantly diminished if they are left in the locker room or on the bench. They're only useful, they're only able to do their job if the player actually puts them on. Which brings us to element number 2. I played hockey growing up, and I was a goalie. And I remember one game when I was in grade 11 or 12, I think. And I was playing in goal, and the play was coming down the ice towards me. And my defenseman and one of the other team got kind of tangled up in each other, and they fell down to the ice. And they were moving fast when they fell, so when they hit the ice, they continued to move fast straight towards me. I wasn't paying attention to them. I was following the rest of the play, had no idea of the impending collision that was about to happen. And at the last minute, I turned and I saw my defenseman was lying on his back with one of his feet up into the air, and then they crashed into me and I crashed into the net. After we got untangled, the game resumed, and I recall feeling a little bit of a burning sensation on my neck, but I just chalked that up to the saltiness of sweat and razor rash from the new electric razor I had been using. When the game was over, though, we went back into the dressing room, and I remember vividly walking into the bathroom in the dressing room and looking in the mirror and seeing a nice thin red line from here to about here, and realizing that I was like millimeters away from a life-threatening cut. The blade of the skate cut deep enough to leave a cut and draw a little bit of blood, but not deep enough to actually slice through. Now, here's the thing. I had a neck protector that would have prevented the slightest scratch in that incident. The thing was, at the time of the collision, that particular piece of equipment was where it usually was, sitting in the bottom of my hockey bag, because it was a little uncomfortable to wear, and so I usually didn't. The biggest thing Paul seems to stress about this spiritual armor is the importance of actually putting it on. So much so that he actually says it twice. He begins by saying, put on all of God's armor so that you'll be able to stand firm against the strategies of the devil. And then again in verse 13, he says, therefore, put on every piece of God's armor so that you will be able to resist the enemy in time of evil. However you interpret the various items of armor that Paul lists, none of them are going to do me a lick of good if I don't actually put them on. And it would seem that Paul has some concerns that the Christians in Ephesus were leaving their armor in their duffel bags. In other words, they weren't doing the things they needed to do to build their relationship with God. They weren't living like people who were on God's team. And if you look at the concepts associated with the armor, they focus on things like truth, righteousness, peace coming from the good news, faith, salvation. Which means that our armor, our protection, comes from our relationship with God. It grows out of our connection to Jesus. Therefore, if you want to beef up your armor, if you're feeling like you have a need for increased protection, strengthen your relationship with God. Increase your connection to Jesus. Jesus says this, or James says this in his letter. He says, humble yourselves before God. Resist the devil, he will flee from you. Come close to God, and God will come close to you. Which ties neatly back into verse 10 and also leads us into section 3 of Paul's conclusion. Paul, never one known for subtlety, hints at the critical element of putting on God's armor to protect ourselves from the attacks of the evil one in the world. See if you can pick it out in the final 3 verses here. He says this, pray in the Spirit at all times and on every occasion. Stay alert and be persistent in your prayers for all the believers everywhere. And pray for me too. Ask God to give me the right words so I can boldly explain God's mysterious plan that the good news is for Jews and Gentiles alike. I am in chains now, still preaching this message as God's ambassadors. So pray that I will keep on speaking boldly as I should. Pray at all times. Pray on every occasion. Be persistent in your prayers. Are you sensing a theme here? One can't help but be reminded of the story Jesus told back in Luke chapter 18. We've labeled this story the parable of the persistent widow. But Luke prefaces the story by saying this. He said, then Jesus told the disciples a parable to show them that they should always pray and not give up. I recall in my childhood memorizing 1 Thessalonians 5:17, which says, pray continually. And I like that verse not because I found it particularly noteworthy at the time, merely because it was one of the shortest verses in the Bible, second only to John 11:35, Jesus wept. And so whenever I had to memorize a certain number of verses to get a prize or a reward of some kind, these were two of my go-to passages. As I got older, I assumed that this verse must be hyperbole. No one could possibly pray continually, or as the New Living Translation words it, never stop praying. As you read more and more of the New Testament, you begin to discover that this idea is not an anomaly. It's a consistent theme. There is some sense in which the New Testament writers and even Jesus himself expect followers of Christ to live with a constant line of communication with God, to live with an ever-present sense of God's Spirit, to always have this realization that God is right there with you all the time, through thick and thin, in good times and bad, in a crowd or in solitude. And the picture of prayer painted by these verses is something more than hands folded and head bowed. It's more than just meal times and bedtimes, although there is a place and a need for focused moments of prayers like that. But these verses call us to function within the reality of God's constant presence, to make your decisions and to choose your words and to interact with others, believing that God is right there with you, to deal with adversity and respond to hostility and navigate disagreements, believing that God is right there with you, to engage in a running dialogue with God through all of it, in each moment of the day, the mundane and the intense, the regular and the extraordinary, the seemingly insignificant and the critically important. And it seems to me that that is the message that Paul wants to leave with the Ephesian church. It's the message that I want to leave us with as we close out our series. It's the message that I need to hear. Remember who God is. Remember what God has done. Remember that God is on your side. And live like God is always at your side.